Book 3, Chapter 2. Waking from hibernation. One more name card. The namelessness of money. Just wanting the land was not going to make it mine, of course. The amount of money I could realistically raise was close to zero. I still had a little of what my mother had left me, but that would evaporate soon in the course of living. I had no job, nothing I could offer as collateral, and there was no bank in the world that would lend money to someone like me out of sheer kindness. I would have to use magic to produce the money from thin air, and soon, one morning, I walked to the station and bought 10, 50 million yen lottery tickets with continuous numbers. Using tracks, I covered a section of the kitchen wall with them and looked at them every day. Sometimes I would spend a whole hour in a chair staring hard at them, as if waiting for a secret code to rise out of them that only I could see. After several days of this, the thought struck me, from nowhere, I'm never going to win the lottery. Before long, I knew this without a doubt. Things were absolutely not going to be solved so easily. By just buying a few lottery tickets and waiting for the results, I would have to get the money through my own efforts. I tore up the lottery tickets and threw them away. Then I stood in front of the wash basin mirror and peered into its depths. There has to be a way, I said to myself in the mirror, but of course there was no reply. Tired of always being shut up in the house with my thoughts, I began to walk around the neighborhood. I continued these aimless walks for 3 or 4 days, and when I tired of the neighborhood, I took the train to Shinjuku. The impulse to go downtown came to me when I happened by the station. Sometimes I thought it helps to think about things in a different setting. It occurred to me, too, that I hadn't been on a train for a very long time. Indeed, while putting my money in the ticket machine, I experienced the nervousness one feels when doing something unfamiliar. When had I last been on the streets of the city? Probably not since I followed the man with the guitar case from the Shinjuku West entrance, more than 6 months earlier. The sight of the crowds in Shinjuku Station I found overwhelming. The flow of people took my breath away and even made my heart pound to some extent. And this wasn't even rush hour. I had trouble making my way through the crush of bodies at first. This was not so much a crowd as a raging torrent, the kind of flood that tears whole houses apart and sweeps them away. I had been walking only a few minutes when I felt the need to calm my nerves. I entered a cafe that faced the avenue and took a seat by one of its large glass windows. Late in the morning, the cafe was not crowded. I ordered a cup of cocoa and half-consciously watched the people walking by outside. I was all but unaware of the passage of time. Perhaps 15 minutes had gone by, perhaps 20, when I realized that my eyes had been following each polished Mercedes-Benz, Jaguar, and Porsche that crept along the jam-packed avenue. In the fresh morning sunlight after a night of rain, these cars sparkled with almost painful intensity, like some kind of symbol. They were absolutely spotless. Those guys have money. Such a thought had never crossed my mind before. I looked at my reflection in the glass and shook my head. This was the first time in my life I had a desperate need for money. When the lunchtime crowd began to fill the cafe, I decided to take a walk. I had no particular goal other than to walk through the city I had not seen for so long. I walked from one street to another, my only thought being to avoid bumping into the people coming toward me. I turned right or left or went straight ahead, depending on the changing of the traffic signals or the whim of the moment. Hands in pockets, I concentrated on the physical act of walking. From the avenues with their rows of department stores and display windows to the back alleys with their garishly decorated porno shops to the lively streets with movie theaters, though the hushed precincts of Shinto shrine, and back to the avenues. It was a warm afternoon, and close to half the crowd had left their coats indoors. The occasional breeze felt pleasant for a change. Before I realized it, I found myself standing in familiar surroundings. I looked at the tiles beneath my feet, at the little sculpture that stood there, and at the tall glass building that towered over me. I was standing in the middle of the small plaza outside the high-rise the very one where I had gone last summer to watch the people passing by, as my uncle had advised me to do. I had kept it up for 11 days then, at the end of which I had followed the weird man with the guitar case into the strange apartment house lobby, where he attacked me with the bat. Aimless, walking around Shinjuku, had brought me to the same exact place. As before, I bought myself coffee and a donut at Dunkin' Donuts and took them with me to the plaza bench. I sat and watched the faces of the people passing by, which put me in an increasingly calm and peaceful mood. It felt good for some reason I could not fathom, as though I had found a comfortable niche in a wall where people would notice me watching them. It had where people would not notice me watching them. It had been a very long time since I had such a good look at people's faces. And not only people's faces, I realized I had hardly really looked, at anything at all over the past 6 months. I sat up straight on the bench and poised myself to look at things. I looked at the people. I looked at the buildings soaring overhead. I looked at the spring sky where the clouds had parted. I looked at the colorful billboards. I picked up a newspaper lying close by and looked at it. Color seemed gradually to be returning to things as evening approached. The next morning I took the train to Shinjuku again. I sat on the same bench and looked at the faces of the people passing by. Again for lunch I had a donut and coffee. I took the train home before the evening rush hour started. I made myself dinner and drank a beer and listened to music on the radio. The next day I did exactly the same thing. Nothing happened that day either. I made no discoveries, solved no riddles, answered no questions. But I did have the vague sense that I was, little by little, moving closer to something. I could see this movement, this gradually increasing closeness. Whenever I looked at myself in the mirror above the sink, the color of my mark was more vivid than before, warmer than before. My mark was alive. I told myself, just as I am alive, my mark is alive. I repeated the routine every day as I had done the previous summer, boarding the train for the city just after 10, sitting on the bench in the plaza by the high-rise and looking at the people passing back and forth. All day without a thought in my head. Now and then, the real sounds around me would grow distant and fade away. The only thing I heard at those times was the deep, quiet sound of water flowing. I thought of Malto Kano. She had talked about listening to the sound of water. Water was her main motive, but I could not recall what Malto Kano had said about the sound of water, nor could I recall her face. All that I could bring back was the red color of her vinyl hat. What she had always worn, why had she always worn that red vinyl hat? But then, sounds gradually returned to me, and once again, I returned my gaze to the face of the people. Faces of the people. On the afternoon of the 8th day of my going to town, a woman spoke to me. At that moment, I happened to be looking in another direction with an empty coffee cup in my hand. "Excuse me," she said. I turned and raised my eyes to the face of a woman standing in front of me. It was the same middle-aged woman I had encountered here last summer, the only person who had spoken to me during the time I spent in the plaza. It had never occurred to me that we would meet again, but when in fact she spoke to me, it seemed like a natural conclusion of a great flow. As before, the woman was extremely well dressed, in terms of both the quality and the individual items of clothing she wore, and the style with which she had combined them. She wore dark tortoiseshell sunglasses, a smoky blue jacket with padded shoulders, and a red flannel skirt. Her blouse was of silk, and on the collar of her jacket shone a finely sculpted gold brooch. Her red high heels were simple in design, but I could have lived several months on what they must have cost her. My own outfit was a mess. As usual, the baseball jacket I bought the year I entered the college, a gray sweatshirt with a stretched-out neck, a frayed blue jeans, and formerly white tennis shoes that were now of an indeterminate color. Despite the contrast, she sat down next to me, crossed her legs, and without a word, took a box of Virginia Slims from her handbag. She offered me a cigarette, as she had last summer, and again I declined. She put one between her lips and lit it, using a long, slender gold lighter the size of an eraser. Then she took off her sunglasses. put them in her jacket pocket, and stared into my eyes as if searching for a coin she had dropped into a shallow pond. I studied her eyes in return. They were strange eyes of great depth, but expressionless. She narrowed her eyes slightly and said, "So you're back." I nodded. I watched the smoke rise from the tip of her narrow cigarette and drifted away on the wind. She turned to survey the scene around us, as if to ascertain, with her own eyes, exactly what it was I had been looking at from the bench. What she saw didn't seem to interest her, though. She turned her eyes to me again. She stared at my mark for a long time, then at my eyes, my nose, my mouth, and then my mark again. I had the feeling that what she really wanted to do was inspect me like a dog in a show, pry my lips open to check my teeth, look into my ears, and wherever else they do. "I guess I need some money now," I said. She paused a moment. "How much?" 80 million yen should do it. She took her eyes from mine and peered up at the sky as if calculating the amount. "Let's see. If I take that from there and move this from here." I studied her makeup all the while, the eyes shadow faint, like the shadow of a thought, the curl of the eyelashes subtle, like some kind of symbol. "That's not a small amount of money," she said with a slight diagonal twist of the lips. "I'd say it's enormous." Her cigarette was only 1/3 smoked when she dropped it to the ground and carefully crushed it beneath the sole of her high-heeled shoes. Then she took a leather calling card case from her slim handbag and thrust the card into my hand. Come to this address at exactly 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon," she said. The address, an office building in the wealthy Alaska district, was the only thing on the card. There was no name. I turned it over to check the back, but it was blank. I brought the card to my nose, but it had no fragrance. It was just a normal white paper card. "No name?" I said. She smiled for the first time and gently shook her head from side to side. "I believe that what you need is money. Does money have a name?" I shook my head, as she was doing. Money had no name, of course. And if it did have a name, it would no longer be money. What gave money its true meaning was its dark night namelessness, its breathtaking interchangeability. She stood up from the bench. "You can come at 4 o'clock, then?" "If I do, you'll put money in my hand?" "I wonder," she said, a smile at the corner of her eyes like wind patterns in the sand. She surveyed the surrounding scene one more time, then smoothed her skirt with a perfunctory sweep of the hand. Taking quick steps, she disappeared into the flow of people. I went on looking at the cigarette she had crushed out, at the lipstick coloring its filtered in. The bright red reminded me of Malto Kano's vinyl hat. If I had anything in my favor, it was that I had nothing to lose. Probably.